What if love isn't love at all, but a slow, quiet erasure of who you are? She spent years in a relationship where affection masked control. It all came crashing down with one cruel joke on her birthday, an unforgettable moment that shattered the illusion. This wasn't love. It was survival. What followed was a journey of rebuilding herself piece by piece, through pain, reflection, and learning to set boundaries without apology. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The small dismissals that I brushed aside as just their sense of humor. The way they'd subtly undermine me, then act like I was being too sensitive when I called it out. The pattern was there from the beginning, but I was too busy constructing elaborate justifications to notice what was happening right in front of me. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming. They were charming, attentive, quick with compliments that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. The beginning was intoxicating. Texts throughout the day, checking in, thoughtful gestures, inside jokes that made me feel like we'd created our own private world. When they said I've never connected with anyone like this before, I believed them. I felt chosen. What I didn't recognize then was how carefully they were studying me. Not to understand me better, but to learn exactly what buttons to push. They were mapping my insecurities like territories to be conquered later. The first 6 months were blissful. We moved in together faster than we should have. When you know, they said. And I nodded along, ignoring the voice that whispered this was too fast. Their apartment was bigger, so I moved in with them. Within weeks, the space no longer felt like mine. My books were cluttering the shelves. My cooking spices were taking over the kitchen. My framed photos were a bit much for the living room. I started taking up less space. Physically, emotionally, conversationally. I learned to gauge their mood the moment they walked through the door, adjusting my behavior accordingly. Bad day at work? Stay quiet. Be soothing. Don't bring up any problems. Good day? Be enthusiastic but not too enthusiastic. Nothing worse than being accused of making everything about you. My friends noticed the change before I did. You seem different, my closest friend said during a rare lunch without my partner. You keep checking your phone, and you hardly talk about your work anymore. I laughed it off, said I was just tired. The truth was, I'd learned that talking about my achievements made my partner strangely cold, as if my success was a personal affront. I started downplaying everything. Got a promotion? It's not a big deal, just more work really. Published an article? The editor basically rewrote it. Ran a half marathon? My time was terrible. I became my own worst critic because it was safer than giving them ammunition. I didn't realize I was disappearing until I couldn't recognize myself anymore. It happened so gradually that I normalized it. The subtle criticisms disguised as concern. Are you sure you want to wear that? Maybe you should think about joining a gym with me. You're being paranoid again. Why do you always make such a big deal out of everything? They had a special tone, halfway between amusement and contempt, that they used when I said something they thought was stupid. It made me second-guess every thought, every opinion, until I found myself mentally rehearsing even the most casual comments before speaking. The thing about emotional erosion is that it's invisible while it's happening. You don't wake up one morning with all your confidence gone. It gets chipped away day after day, comment after comment, until you're standing on unstable ground, constantly afraid of collapse. I started losing time to anxiety spirals. Hours spent analyzing conversations, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, why they were suddenly distant or irritated. I'd apologize for things I wasn't sure I'd done. I'm sorry if I upset you earlier. I'm sorry about dinner. I'm sorry I didn't notice you were stressed. I was constantly scanning for threats, for signs of their disapproval. My world narrowed. I stopped calling my parents as often, because it was easier than navigating my partner's subtle mood shift when I mentioned them. I saw friends less, because social gatherings inevitably led to a post-mortem where my behavior was dissected. You were flirting with that server. You always act differently around your college friends. Did you have to tell that story about me? The worst part was that between these moments, they could be wonderful. Attentive, affectionate, making grand romantic gestures that reminded me why I'd fallen in love. They'd bring me coffee in bed, plan elaborate date nights, hold my hand during movies, and trace patterns on my skin. These glimpses of tenderness kept me hoping, kept me believing that if I could just figure out how to be better, we could stay in that good place forever. I became obsessed with being the perfect partner. I monitored my tone, my facial expressions, made mental notes of their preferences, anticipated their needs before they expressed them. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance. But I told myself it was worth it. This was what relationships required: compromise, effort, putting the other person first. What I didn't admit was that it was only me doing the compromising, me making all the effort, me putting them first while they rarely returned the favor. The birthday incident wasn't the first public humiliation. There had been others, smaller, easier to rationalize. The time they told a story at a dinner party about how hilariously bad I was at parallel parking. The way they'd correct my pronunciation of words in front of others. The constant jokes about my obsession with a TV show I'd mentioned maybe twice. Each time I'd swallow my hurt and smile along. Each time I'd tell myself I was being oversensitive. Each time I'd feel a little more hollow. But something about that birthday night was different. Maybe it was having my family there, my mother's face as she registered what the shirt said, my father's uncomfortable attempt to change the subject. Maybe it was the casual cruelty of making my fertility into a public joke when they knew how much anxiety I carried about whether I'd ever have children. We'd had conversations about it. Late night, vulnerable conversations where I'd admitted my fears about waiting too long, about possibly missing my chance. They'd held me as I cried once, telling them about the doctor's appointment where I'd been told that some of my levels weren't ideal, that it might be more difficult for me than for others. And they'd turned that confession into a punchline for our friends and family. I remember sitting there, the shirt in my hands, feeling like I was floating outside my body, watching the scene from above. Everyone waiting for my reaction. Some already laughing, others catching the discomfort in the air. And my partner, looking at me with that expectant smile that said, "Dbe cool. Take the joke. Don't make this weird." I had spent 3 years contorting myself to avoid that particular look of disappointment. 3 years walking on eggshells, moderating my emotions, making myself smaller and more acceptable. 3 years convincing myself that love was supposed to feel like constantly bracing for impact. Walking out of that restaurant was the first authentic thing I'd done in months. It wasn't planned or strategic. My body simply stood up and removed itself from the situation while my mind was still processing the hurt. For once, I didn't consider how it would look or what people would think. I just knew I couldn't sit there for one more second pretending to be okay. They didn't come after me. That's what still gets me when I think back on that night. They didn't follow me out of the restaurant, didn't call to see if I was okay, didn't seem to consider for a moment that their joke had caused real pain. Instead, they showed up hours later, indignant that I embarrassed them. Not concerned about my feelings, not apologetic about misjudging the situation so badly, just angry that I'd broken the unspoken rule of our relationship: never make them look bad. I sat on our couch, emotionally drained, as they paced and ranted about how I'd overreacted, how it was just a shirt, how I'd ruined the night. I remember thinking how strange it was to watch someone I loved be so completely incapable of empathy in that moment. It was like finally seeing a magic trick revealed. The illusion was broken, and I couldn't unsee the mechanics behind it. "You're making this into such a big deal," they said, exasperated. It was a joke. Everyone was having a good time until you decided to be dramatic. I felt oddly calm as I asked, "Did it seem like I was having a good time?" They faltered for a moment before recovering. "You're too sensitive. You can't take a joke." Those words, I'd heard them so many times before. But this time, instead of accepting them, I heard them differently. Too sensitive compared to what? Too sensitive for whom? Why was the baseline for acceptable emotional response always set by them, never by me? "Maybe," I said slowly, "I'm exactly as sensitive as I should be. Maybe the problem isn't that I can't take a joke, but that you think publicly humiliating me on my birthday is funny." The look of shock on their face might have been comical in another context. They weren't used to me pushing back. Neither was I. What followed was a week of strained silence, punctuated by attempts at normal conversation that felt like putting bandages on a wound that needed surgery. They bought me a different gift, an expensive bracelet that felt like a transaction rather than an apology. I thanked them politely and put it in my drawer. It felt tainted somehow, a consolation prize for agreeing to continue the charade. I started noticing things I'd been willfully blind to before. How conversations always revolved around their interests, their problems, their needs. How they'd subtly undermine my accomplishments while expecting effusive praise for their own. How they'd withdraw affection whenever I failed to prioritize them sufficiently. It was like suddenly gaining the ability to see ultraviolet light. Patterns that had always been there were now glaringly obvious. I'd like to say that I made a clean break after the birthday incident. That I packed my things and walked away with my head held high. The reality was messier, more gradual, more human. I started by reclaiming small pieces of myself. I called my parents without checking if it was a good time first. I reconnected with friends I'd slowly lost touch with. I spoke up when I disagreed instead of nodding along to keep the peace. Each tiny rebellion felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, like stretching muscles that had atrophied from disuse. My partner noticed, of course. They cycled through strategies: confusion, concern, anger, charm, withdrawal, intensity, trying to find the approach that would return me to my compliant state. When nothing worked, they became desperate. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately," they said one night as I put on my coat to meet a friend for dinner. "You're acting like you don't want to be in this relationship anymore." I paused, one arm in my sleeve. "Maybe I don't." The words surprised us both. I hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even consciously thought them until they were hanging in the air between us. But once spoken, they felt undeniably true. What followed was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. There were tears on both sides, grief for what we'd thought we had, for what might have been if things had been different. They promised to change, to do better, to go to therapy. Part of me wanted to believe it was possible, but a larger part recognized that the damage was too extensive, the patterns too ingrained. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, couldn't unfeel what I'd felt, and I couldn't trust that things would truly change when they still couldn't fully acknowledge what had been happening. "I need to leave," I said finally. "Not just this apartment, this relationship, because of a stupid t-shirt." They were incredulous. "No, I'll wait. Because I don't recognize myself anymore. Because I'm exhausted from constantly managing your emotions while suppressing my own. Because I shouldn't have to make myself smaller to make you comfortable." They looked at me like I was speaking a language they couldn't comprehend. And perhaps I was. The vocabulary of self-worth and boundaries had never been part of our shared lexicon. I found an apartment within a week. It was small, more expensive than I wanted, and nowhere near as nice as the place we'd shared. But as I carried in my first box of belongings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the simple joy of taking up space without apology. The first month on my own was the hardest. Not because I missed them, though sometimes I did, in a complicated, conflicted way, but because I had to face the extent of what had happened to me. The person I'd become in that relationship was a stranger, meek, constantly anxious, perpetually apologetic. I'd wake up in the middle of the night in a panic, reaching for my phone to check if I'd missed a text or call, before remembering I didn't need to explain my whereabouts anymore. I'd catch myself mentally rehearsing conversations, preparing defenses for opinions I was entitled to have. I'd feel guilty for watching shows they'd dismissed as stupid or reading books they'd mocked me for enjoying. The hardest realization was acknowledging my own role in what had happened. I did not want to see what water get wild. Not that the emotional manipulation was my fault, it wasn't, but that I'd participated in my own diminishment. I ignored red flags, rationalized bad behavior, prioritized keeping the peace over protecting myself. I'd wanted so badly to be loved that I'd accepted something that wasn't love at all. My therapist helped me understand that this wasn't weakness but a human response to a toxic dynamic. The frog in the pot doesn't realize the water is getting hotter, she said. It adjusts and adjusts until adjustment isn't possible anymore. I started rebuilding myself piece by piece. I relearned my own preferences, what I actually liked to eat, what music moved me, how I wanted to spend my weekends. I rediscovered old interests that had been dismissed as silly or waste of time. I reconnected with the parts of myself I'd abandoned in pursuit of being the perfect partner. There were setbacks. They'd text late at night when I was most vulnerable, sometimes angry accusations, sometimes nostalgic reminiscences, sometimes seemingly genuine apologies. Each message would unsettle me for days afterward, leaving me questioning my decision, my memory, my perception of what had happened between us. 6 weeks after moving out, I ran into them at a coffee shop. I'd been dreading this inevitable encounter, imagining all the ways it might go wrong. But the reality was anticlimactic. We exchanged awkward hellos. They looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than in my memory. The conversation was brief, superficial, strained with all that remained unsaid. As I watched them walk away, I felt a complex emotion, not quite relief, not quite sadness, but something like recognition. I could see more clearly now what I'd been unable to see before. They were just a person, flawed and damaged in their own ways, neither the villain nor the hero I'd alternately made them out to be. That night, I deleted their number from my phone and removed the last of their photos from my apartment. Not in anger, but as an acknowledgement that some chapters need to properly close before new ones can begin. A year has passed since my birthday dinner. A year of therapy, of uncomfortable realizations, of grief and growth and gradual healing. A year of learning to trust my own perceptions again, of remembering how to exist without constantly monitoring another person's emotions. Recovery wasn't linear. There were days when I'd feel strong, centered, grateful for my freedom. And there were days when loneliness would hit like a physical blow, when I'd question everything, when I'd wonder if I'd exaggerated the bad and forgotten the good. But slowly, steadily, I found my way back to myself, or rather, forward to a new version of myself. One who understood her worth wasn't determined by someone else's ability to see it. One who could recognize the early warning signs of emotional manipulation. One who knew that real love doesn't require self-erasure. I started dating again, cautiously. The first few attempts were disastrous. I was hypersensitive to any sign of control or dismissal, ready to flee at the first hint of criticism. But gradually, I learned to distinguish between normal human flaws and genuinely concerning behavior. I learned that disagreement doesn't have to mean disapproval, that healthy relationships involve mutual accommodation, rather than one person constantly yielding. 6 months ago, I met someone new. We're taking things slowly, both of us carrying lessons from past relationships. They listen when I speak. They notice when I'm withdrawing and gently check in rather than assuming what I'm feeling. When I explain why certain jokes or comments might be triggering for me, they don't dismiss my concerns or tell me I'm too sensitive. They simply adjust, without making me feel burdensome for having boundaries. It feels strange sometimes, this new normal. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the mask to slip, for the subtle undermining to begin. But so far, it hasn't. Instead, there's a steady building of trust, a gradual unfurling of defenses on both sides. Last week was my birthday again. No big celebration this time, just a quiet dinner with a few close friends. My new partner asked what I wanted as a gift. I hesitated, still not entirely comfortable expressing desires or preferences. Anything, I said finally. As long as it's not a t-shirt with a joke about my biological clock. I'd meant it lightly, but their expression turned serious. I would never, they said. Not because it wouldn't be funny, though it wouldn't be, but because I know how much that hurt you. Something about that moment, being seen, being remembered, having my pain acknowledged without drama or defensiveness, felt like a milestone. Not because their response was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. The bare minimum of human decency and empathy that should be commonplace, but had come to seem exceptional to me. I still think about my ex sometimes. Not with longing or regret, with a complex mixture of clarity and compassion. I understand now that what happened between us wasn't unique or special. It was a sadly common dynamic, one that plays out in countless relationships where power and control masquerade as love and protection. If there's anything I've learned from all of this, it's that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating the experience into your story without letting it define you. It means recognizing patterns without becoming cynical. It means trusting again, not blindly, but with open eyes and firm boundaries. The t-shirt incident wasn't the cause of our breakup. It was just the moment when I could no longer ignore what had been happening for years. In that sense, painful as it was also a gift. A moment of such obvious disrespect that cut through all my careful rationalizations and showed me the truth. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed that night, laughed along with everyone else, worn the shirt to bed as a sign that I could take a joke. How much longer would I have continued disappearing? How much more of myself would I have sacrificed on the altar of keeping the peace? I don't have those answers, and I don't need them. What I know is this: walking out of that restaurant was the first step on a long journey home to myself. It wasn't dramatic or vengeful. It was quiet, necessary self-preservation. The journey isn't over. There are still days when I doubt my worth, when I automatically minimize my needs, when I brace for criticism that isn't coming. Old habits die hard. I heard you. Ooh, da. But each time I catch myself falling into those patterns, I pause, breathe, and gently remind myself of a truth I'm still learning to believe. I deserve to take up space in this world, unapologetically, exactly as I am. And anyone who suggests otherwise has no place in my life.